river everywhere! I can check gunmen! Enough!
In just 8 minutes, a single Australian aircraft faced an entire Japanese flotilla. When the reports reached command, the response was immediate. This is impossible. There must be an error. But there was no error at all. What happened that morning in the Pacific was so absurd that even today it's studied as one of the most improbable attacks in military aviation history. Imagine you're flying over a grey sea without air cover, with limited ammunition, fuel running low, and suddenly, below you, 11 enemy vessels armed to the teeth, transporting troops, supplies, and heavy artillery. Now imagine you're completely alone. No escort, no support, no second chance. Logic says retreat. The manuals say wait for reinforcements. Survival screams to flee. But the Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighter pilot did exactly the opposite. He dove straight into hell. Over the next 50 minutes, you're going to discover who this almost unknown pilot was in the grand narrative of history, why that mission should never have been authorized by any rational command structure. How a single aircraft managed to destroy 11 war vessels in just 8 minutes of sustained combat, and why, when the detailed report reached high command, the official response was categorically, "This is impossible." What you're about to hear sounds like pure fiction, something pulled from a Hollywood screenplay, but it happened. And it was meticulously recorded in real Second World War operational documents. And the further you go into this story, the more you realize that reality can be far more unbelievable, far more dramatic, and far more extraordinary than any war film ever created. In 1943, the Pacific Theater was a chessboard on fire. Japan and the Allied forces disputed every single island, every maritime route, every kilometer of open ocean in a brutal war of attrition. And in the middle of this chaos, in the middle of this desperate struggle for control, there existed an aircraft that few military strategists really took seriously. The Bristol Beaufighter. It wasn't beautiful by any measure. It wasn't fast, like a nimble fighter aircraft. It didn't have the romantic fame of a Spitfire or the fearsome reputation of a Japanese Zero. But it had something no other aircraft possessed in quite the same devastating way. Brutal, concentrated firepower designed specifically for low-level flight operations. The Beaufighter was practically a flying cannon with wings attached, equipped with 4 20mm cannons mounted in the nose, 6.303 caliber machine guns, and capable of flying at wave-top height with remarkable stability. It was engineered to perfection for one specific type of mission, hunting enemy ships along coastal waters. But that particular morning, in the skies above northern Australia, it shouldn't have been engaged in any combat operation at all. The original mission briefing was simple, almost routine, an armed reconnaissance flight over designated patrol zones. Nothing more than that, standard procedure. Until, breaking through the horizon's early morning mist, something appeared that would change everything in an instant. An entire Japanese flotilla, 11 barges, fully loaded with military cargo, moving in formation, completely real. And in that precise instant, suspended in that cockpit above the Pacific, the pilot had a choice that would last exactly 8 minutes, but would echo for decades through military history books and classified operational reports. The radar equipment showed absolutely nothing. No air threat detected, no enemy formation predicted on that particular route according to intelligence briefings. It was supposed to be just another boring, uneventful flight over empty waters, the kind pilots sometimes called milk runs. But ahead, breaking through the horizon's light mist, something began to take definite shape. First, tiny dark dots against the blue. Then, clearer silhouettes. Finally, the chilling, absolute certainty washing over him like ice water. Japanese ships. Many of them. They weren't destroyers with heavy armor. They weren't cruisers with sophisticated defensive systems, and precisely because of that apparent vulnerability, they were even more dangerous in that specific tactical context. They were military transport barges, the workhorses of Japanese supply operations, in a somewhat irregular formation, clearly not expecting air attack. Loaded absolutely to the limit with fresh troops ready for deployment, military trucks, wooden crates packed with ammunition, fuel barrels stacked precariously, and light artillery pieces secured to the decks. An improvised convoy, certainly, but absolutely deadly in terms of strategic value. If those barges reached their destination, they would reinforce Japanese positions significantly. That Beaufighter was completely alone in the sky, without escort fighters, without air cover of any kind, without direct radio communication with nearby reinforcements. The standard operating protocol was crystal clear. Multiple enemy sighting, retreat immediately and report to command. But there was a significant problem with following protocol this time. The barges were less than 2 minutes from visual range of Allied observation posts, and they were sailing directly toward a poorly defended Allied island position. If they arrived safely, it meant substantial Japanese reinforcement, more Allied deaths in the coming days, more territory lost in the grinding Pacific campaign. The pilot looked carefully at his instruments with growing urgency. Fuel gauge, limited, barely enough for combat and return. Ammunition counters, enough for perhaps one single serious attack run, maybe two if he was extremely precise. And then he realized something critical that no military manual had ever predicted or prepared him for. The flotilla appeared to have no organized anti-aircraft defense whatsoever. Most of the barges had, at absolute most, light machine guns, clearly improvised, poorly positioned, manned by soldiers who weren't specialist anti-aircraft gunners. Perfect targets for an aircraft specifically designed to fly low and kill fast with overwhelming firepower. In the cramped cockpit, there was no heroic internal monologue. There was no dramatic soundtrack playing. Just the steady roar of twin engines and a decision that needed to be made in mere seconds. A decision that would determine not just his fate, but potentially the fate of Allied soldiers on that island. Do I return to base and let them pass unopposed? Or do I attack, knowing there's absolutely no plan B, no backup, no rescue if things go wrong? If he miscalculated, he'd be shot down within seconds, fall into the cold Pacific, disappear without even leaving identifiable wreckage for recovery teams. But if he succeeded, if somehow this worked, he could change the entire tactical situation, could save Allied lives, could prevent enemy reinforcement. It was then that he did something no operational report had ever predicted, something that defied standard combat doctrine. He tilted the control column forward with steady hands, reduced altitude aggressively, and dove straight toward the barges in a committed attack run. Alone, against 11 armed vessels, without reinforcements waiting, without air cover protecting him, without backup whatsoever. The cockpit chronometer showed 8 minutes of useful combat fuel available for sustained operations. And in that precise instant began one of the most insane, most improbable attacks ever recorded in Royal Australian Air Force operational history. The Beaufighter descended like a predator, spotting prey, not in uncontrolled free fall, but at that precise angle between maximum speed and absolute control, the kind of attack dive only genuinely experienced combat pilots dared execute under fire. The grey-blue water rose fast in the windscreen perspective. The barges grew rapidly in his field of vision, transforming from distant shapes to detailed targets. And suddenly, almost violently, they stopped being abstract dots on the horizon and became immediate, tangible targets, with men visible on the decks. The first Japanese reaction was telling. Delay, confusion, disbelief. For several crucial seconds, nobody fired back at him. It was as if the soldiers down there simply didn't believe what their eyes were showing them. A single aircraft alone attacking an entire armed flotilla. Tactically insane. Suicidal, impossible. When they finally realized this was real, that this was actually happening, it was already far too late to mount effective defense. The pilot aligned the first barge in his gun sight with practiced precision, breathed deeply once to steady himself, and squeezed the trigger mechanism firmly. The Beaufighter roared like thunder. 4 20mm cannons fired simultaneously in perfect synchronization. 6 machine guns spat continuous fire at the same instant. The entire aircraft shook violently from the recoil, vibrating so intensely it felt as if the airframe were tearing itself apart in mid-air. The first concentrated bursts went straight through the barge from bow to stern, punching through wood and thin metal plating like paper. Wood, metal fragments and human bodies exploded in seconds. The deck transformed instantly into a churning cloud of deadly splinters, thick black smoke, and bodies thrown violently into the sea. Without slowing his airspeed even slightly, he pulled smoothly on the control column and slid the aircraft sideways toward the second target, already lined up. Now the real hell opened up around him. Japanese machine guns began firing desperately from all sides, from multiple barges simultaneously. Tracer rounds rose in crooked, panicked lines, creating a lethal web of fire. Bullets cut through the air surrounding the Beaufighter, some passing within centimeters of the fuselage. But the aircraft was flying too low for effective tracking, moving too fast for accurate targeting, and delivering firepower too brutal for the enemy to process tactically. Each attack pass lasted only a few seconds of sustained fire, but left behind catastrophic destruction. Roaring fire, billowing black smoke. Men jumping desperately into the water, engines exploding in secondary detonations, ammunition loads cooking off and detonating in violent chain reactions that tore vessels apart. On the third barge hit in rapid succession, something dramatically different happened. The Beaufighter's concentrated fire struck directly into a fuel compartment stored below deck. The explosion was so massively powerful that the shockwave physically rocked the aircraft itself violently in the air, nearly throwing it off course. For one heart-stopping second, the pilot genuinely thought he'd taken a direct hit, that his aircraft was finished. But no, it was just the enemy vessel literally disintegrating below him in a fireball. In less than 2 minutes of sustained combat, 3 barges were completely out of action. 2 engulfed in flames, burning fiercely, 1 sinking slowly but steadily, taking on water fast. And the most absurd, most improbable thing, the Beaufighter still hadn't suffered a single critical hit to vital systems. No engine damaged, no wing structure compromised, no flight control systems failing. It was as if the aircraft was somehow untouchable, protected by impossible luck. But there was a growing problem he couldn't ignore. 8 barges remained operational. And now, critically, all of them knew with absolute certainty they were being actively hunted by a determined attacker. The precious element of surprise had completely ended. From that moment forward, each passing second would be statistically more dangerous than the last, the odds stacking against him. And the pilot knew with cold clarity, if he wanted to survive this, to get out alive, he'd have to do something no military manual taught, something that defied doctrine. Keep attacking aggressively. Now, it was no longer a one-sided attack. It had transformed into a mutual hunt, predator and prey switching roles constantly. The Japanese barges were already attempting defensive formation. Machine guns swiveled and pointed at the sky. Soldiers fired non-stop, desperate. Tracer rounds cut through the air like glowing webs of red light, creating curtains of fire. The Beaufighter no longer had surprise as an advantage. Each new approach run was, statistically speaking, mathematically closer to death. And even knowing this, understanding the odds completely, he returned for another pass. The pilot did something absolutely no flight instructor would ever recommend in training. He descended even lower than before, so dangerously low that in some heart-stopping moments the landing gear nearly touched the wave tops, mere meters from disaster. The tactical logic was simultaneously simple and completely insane. The lower he flew, the less effective angle for enemy machine guns to track and hit him. The closer he approached, the greater the devastating, destructive power of his cannons at point-blank range. He passed between two barges, threading the needle, as if crossing a narrow corridor made entirely of fire and tracers. Bullets hammered into the fuselage constantly. Some ricocheted off with metallic pings. Others punched straight through non-critical parts of the aircraft, leaving clean holes. The sound inside the cockpit was absolute chaos, metal being struck repeatedly, alarm systems screaming, the engines roaring at maximum combat power. But somehow, impossibly, the Beaufighter kept flying. On the fourth barge, he aimed straight at the bow with calculated precision. Continuous fire for 3 full seconds. The vessel's engine compartment exploded catastrophically. The boat immediately lost all control and power. It turned slowly, aimlessly, beginning to sink sideways as water rushed in. On the fifth target, the pilot did something even more tactically dangerous, more reckless. He didn't fire on approach. Instead, he passed directly overhead at high speed, climbed slightly to gain position, turned sharply in a tight combat turn, and attacked from completely behind, from the rear quarter. He caught the barge at the stern, precisely where the main supply depot was located. The impact was so surgically precise that the resulting explosion threw debris dozens of meters into the air. It was like watching steel dominoes falling sequentially into the sea, one after another. Any other aircraft design would have already been shot down, destroyed. But the Beaufighter had 3 critical advantages that kept it alive: heavy, reinforced structure designed to absorb punishment, twin engines capable of sustaining significant damage and continuing to function, and perfect speed characteristics for low-level attack profiles. Even so, even with these advantages, now it was definitely being hit repeatedly. A projectile punched through the side of the cockpit, missing the pilot by centimeters. Another round perforated one of the wings, tearing through aluminum. Metal fragments cut into part of the instrument panel, destroying gauges. The pilot began smelling fuel vapor in the cockpit. Any leak, any single spark, would mean instant catastrophic explosion and death. And 6 barges still remained operational, still dangerous. Half the fuel had already been consumed, a substantial portion of ammunition too, and at that critical point, any rational human being would have immediately retreated to base. But he didn't retreat. He did exactly what the official reports would later describe as inexplicable operational behavior that defied standard combat doctrine. He turned around and went back for yet another attack pass. The cockpit chronometer showed somewhere between 6 and 7 minutes of continuous sustained combat. For whoever was in the air, living it, it seemed like an eternity, time stretching impossibly. For whoever would analyze the engagement later from safe offices, it would seem like an absolute lie. Impossible. The pilot no longer consciously felt his body. It was pure reflex, muscle memory, combat instinct taking over completely. The Beaufighter vibrated strangely, unnaturally. The fuselage was heavily marked by multiple impacts. Part of the instrument panel blinked intermittently, systems failing, but incredibly it still flew, and it still had targets remaining. He entered diagonally this time, a different approach angle, less predictable for defenders. On the 6th barge, he aimed straight at the waterline, the most vulnerable point. The concentrated cannon fire punched through the hull, below the surface. Water began entering violently, uncontrollably. In less than 30 seconds, the boat lost all buoyancy. It sank bow first, swallowed entirely by its own weight and the rushing water. On the seventh target, the pilot noticed something genuinely frightening, psychologically devastating. Japanese soldiers were abandoning the vessel even before his attack run, even before he fired. They jumped desperately into the sea, dropped their weapons, ran in absolute panic. Terror had already spread like wildfire through the entire flotilla. The Beaufighter was no longer perceived as just an aircraft. It had become a psychological presence, an invisible predator that appeared from nowhere, killed with precision, and disappeared flush with the sea surface. The last remaining barges began to disperse chaotically. They lost all formation coordination. Each vessel tried desperately to flee in a different direction, breaking formation discipline. And that panicked reaction was their fatal tactical error. Separated, isolated, they became far easier to hunt individually. The pilot chose the 8th, then immediately the 9th, without stopping, without hesitation. Each attack pass lasted less than 10 seconds of sustained fire. Each burst was surgically precise. Nothing wasted, not a single round. On the 9th barge, the explosion was so tremendously powerful that one of the Beaufighter's engines actually choked and sputtered for several terrifying moments. The sudden silence inside the cockpit lasted perhaps half a second, but it was enough for the pilot to think with absolute certainty, "It's over. Now I fall and die." But against all odds, the engine coughed and returned to life, and he continued attacking. 2 barges remained, just 2. The aircraft was almost completely out of ammunition, with fuel actively leaking from damaged tanks, with clearly visible structural damage to the airframe. It was literally the last possible attack pass before he'd be forced to break off. The pilot chose not to climb for position, not to circle for a better angle, not to reposition tactically. He went in a straight line, directly through the middle of concentrated fire, committed completely. The 10th barge exploded violently after a direct sustained burst on the main deck. The 11th tried desperately to turn away, to evade, but there simply wasn't enough time. 3 seconds of continuous concentrated fire. The engine stopped dead. The hull split open. The vessel began sinking slowly, tilted at an impossible angle. And then, suddenly, silence. Profound silence. There were no more targets afloat, no more gunfire, nothing else moving on the water. In exactly 8 minutes, an entire military flotilla had been systematically destroyed by a single aircraft. 11 barges, 11 alone, without reinforcement arriving, without air cover protecting him, without any coherent plan. The pilot climbed altitude for the first time since the beginning of the attack. He looked back over his shoulder. The sea was covered with smoke, roaring fire, scattered debris, spreading oil slicks, and men desperately trying to survive in the cold water. He breathed deeply, shakily. And in that moment, he realized something simultaneously simple and utterly terrifying. He had just survived something that statistically, mathematically shouldn't exist, and he still needed to somehow get home. The silence inside the damaged cockpit was deafening after the chaos. After 8 solid minutes of absolute chaos, there were no more shots being fired, no explosions, no targets, just the irregular sound of damaged engines and the wind cutting through holes in the fuselage. The pilot pulled the control column carefully, gently. The Beaufighter climbed slowly, like a wounded animal trying desperately not to faint. It was then that he began to truly perceive the real extent of the damage. The left wing was perforated with multiple holes. The landing gear showed abnormal vibration. Part of the instrument simply didn't work anymore, dark and dead. The fuel indicator blinked weakly at the absolute limit. There was definite leakage. If one engine failed now, there would be no time for controlled forced landing, just cold sea, just silence and death. Even so, he maintained course back to base, without radio working properly, without anyone knowing what had just happened. When the battered Beaufighter appeared on the horizon of the Australian base, the controllers thought it was just another routine aircraft returning. Nobody was expecting heroes. Nobody was expecting historical reports. When it touched down hard on the runway, the mechanics ran toward it, not to congratulate, but to understand in disbelief how that thing was still in one piece. The aircraft looked like it had flown through a metal storm. Bullet holes everywhere across the fuselage, fragments embedded deep in the aluminum, burnt sections. One of the senior technicians would later say, "This aircraft had no physical right to have returned. It should be scrap metal." Hours later, after being debriefed, the pilot delivered the official combat report. 11 Japanese barges destroyed in solo attack operation. The intelligence officer read it carefully, read it again, read it a third time with growing disbelief, and responded flatly, "Impossible. You must have seen wrong, miscounted." They demanded coordinates, exact time, flight route, ammunition expended, type of vessel engaged. Everything was meticulously recorded. Everything seemed internally coherent, but still nobody believed it. It seemed too impossible. Until 2 days later, a follow-up reconnaissance mission was sent to the exact same area. What they found wasn't narrative, wasn't story. It was physical reality. Debris scattered for kilometers, giant oil slicks, remains of sunken hulls, no flotilla, no convoy. 11 barges had simply disappeared from the map. It was at that moment that the official tone changed dramatically. The report stopped being dismissed as impossible and became classified as an operational event without precedent in theater operations. But the most curious thing, no major newspaper ever reported it. No film was ever made. No decoration ceremony became a headline. The story was quietly archived, like so many others from the war, and the pilot went back to flying normal missions as if nothing absurd had happened. But what he did that day would silently enter the list of the most improbable actions in military history. There are battles that win wars, there are battles that change maps permanently, and there are battles that change absolutely nothing strategically. No border was redrawn because of that attack. No peace treaty was signed because of it. No general won a medal for it. And even so, that episode remains as one of the most extreme moments of what we call human capacity under impossible pressure. If you put this story in a cinema script, someone would immediately say too exaggerated, completely unreal. One single aircraft, 11 armed vessels, 8 minutes, without reinforcement, without a plan, without critical failures. Statistical logic says categorically he should have died on the first pass. The real probability of survival was mathematically close to zero. But war was never a logical environment. It's the territory where the improbable violently meets the real. The name of that pilot barely appears in history books. He didn't become a popular legend. He didn't become a famous documentary subject. He didn't become a viral hero. And perhaps that's the most symbolic thing of all. Most of the most absurd acts in human history aren't remembered by crowds. They exist only in cold reports, dusty archives, emotionless lines of text. But behind those lines existed someone who, for 8 minutes, surpassed all rational limits of what a human being should do. Not for glory, not for fame, but for a silent decision made inside a cockpit. If I don't stop them, perhaps they'll stop nothing. What really sank there weren't just barges. What sank was the idea that history is made only by giant strategies. What sank was the notion that individuals don't matter. What sank was the belief that everything can be predicted. What happened that day was a brutal reminder. Sometimes a single person in a single moment is capable of generating an event that no system, no statistic, no command can explain. And that's exactly what most frightens and most fascinates us about human history. Perhaps the most disturbing thing isn't the attack itself, but the fact that, at this exact moment, there are thousands of real stories like this that were never told, never filmed, never remembered. Stories of ordinary people who, for a few minutes, did things that seem impossible and disappeared, back into the anonymous flow of time, as if nothing had happened, as if the impossible were just another forgotten detail of reality.